He was betrayed before he ever became powerful. Long before the palaces of Egypt, before the gold, before the royal chariots and whispered commands inside Pharaoh's court, there was only a frightened young man lying at the bottom of a dry pit somewhere in the wilderness of Canaan. Above him, the voices of his own brothers faded into the desert wind while traders approached in the distance. That moment changed history, because the story of Joseph is not simply a religious tale preserved in ancient scripture. For thousands of years, historians, archaeologists, theologians, and skeptics have debated whether the rise of this mysterious Hebrew slave may have been connected to real political chaos inside ancient Egypt. Some believe Joseph was merely symbolic, a literary figure created to teach faith and morality. Others believe his story hides fragments of an actual forgotten crisis buried beneath the sands of the Bronze Age. And strangely, modern discoveries continue to keep the mystery alive. Ancient Egypt was one of the most powerful civilizations on Earth. Massive temples lined the Nile. Pharaohs ruled like living gods. Armies protected trade routes stretching across deserts and seas. But beneath the wealth and grandeur, Egypt lived in constant fear of instability. Everything depended on the Nile River. If the floods failed, the empire starved. And that fear would eventually create the perfect conditions for a foreign slave to rise into unimaginable power. According to the book of Genesis, Joseph was born into a deeply divided family. His father Jacob favored him openly, giving him gifts and status that his older brothers never received. In tribal societies of the ancient Near East, favoritism was dangerous. Inheritance determined survival. Leadership inside the family meant authority over land, livestock, and future generations. Then Joseph began sharing strange dreams. In one vision, bundles of grain bowed before him. In another, stars and celestial bodies lowered themselves in submission. Today, those dreams sound symbolic, but in the ancient world, dreams were treated as messages from divine powers. Egyptian priests, Babylonian astrologers, and Canaanite rulers all relied heavily on dream interpretation to guide political decisions. Joseph's dreams sounded less like fantasy and more like prophecy. His brothers hated him for it. Archaeologists studying ancient Semitic cultures have found evidence that family betrayal, exile, and inheritance violence were far more common than many people realize. Tablets discovered in Mesopotamian cities describe brothers selling relatives into slavery during disputes over property and power. Joseph's story suddenly feels disturbingly realistic. One day, while traveling far from home, his brothers decided to remove him permanently. The biblical account describes them throwing Joseph into an empty cistern before selling him to traders heading toward Egypt. Some historians believe these traders were part of ancient caravan routes linking Canaan to the Nile Delta. Routes heavily involved in both commerce and human trafficking. Joseph disappeared into Egypt as a slave, and he should have vanished from history completely. Most slaves did, but Egypt during this period was changing. Foreign populations from Canaan and Syria were increasingly entering the Nile Delta. Some scholars connect Joseph's timeline to the rise of the Hyksos, mysterious foreign rulers who gained influence inside northern Egypt during a period of political instability. That detail matters, because if Joseph truly existed, his rise may not have been impossible after all. Foreign administrators were becoming valuable, especially intelligent ones. The Genesis account claims Joseph was eventually purchased by Potiphar, a high-ranking Egyptian official. Inside Potiphar's household, Joseph quickly proved himself useful. He understood organization, resource management, human behavior, The same young man once mocked for his dreams now demonstrated something far more dangerous: leadership. But power inside ancient Egypt always came with risk. Then came the accusation. Potiphar's wife attempted to seduce Joseph, and when he refused, she accused him of assault. In ancient Egyptian society, a slave accused of violating an elite household could be executed immediately. Yet Joseph was imprisoned instead of killed. Some historians find this detail fascinating. Why spare him? Was Potiphar uncertain of the accusation? Did Joseph already possess unusual influence? Or was he considered too valuable to eliminate entirely? No one knows. But once again, Joseph entered darkness. The prisons of ancient Egypt were brutal places: underground cells, forced labor, disease, isolation. Many prisoners simply disappeared without record. Yet according to tradition, Joseph survived because of an unusual gift: the ability to interpret dreams. Inside prison, two former servants of Pharaoh experienced disturbing visions they could not understand. Joseph interpreted both with terrifying accuracy. One would be restored, the other would die. And both predictions came true. This was more than superstition in the ancient world. Egyptian civilization placed enormous importance on symbolic knowledge. Priests spent years studying omens, celestial movements, rituals, and visions. Dreams were considered possible messages from the divine realm. Then Pharaoh himself began having nightmares. 7 healthy cattle devoured by 7 starving cattle. Healthy grain consumed by diseased crops. None of Egypt's priests could explain the meaning. And suddenly, Joseph was remembered. Imagine the scene. A Hebrew prisoner dragged from a dungeon into the court of one of the most powerful rulers on earth. Gold pillars rising toward painted ceilings, armed guards standing silently beside the throne, priests watching carefully for mistakes. One wrong answer could mean death. But Joseph did not hesitate. 7 years of abundance. 7 years of famine. Egypt needed to prepare immediately or face catastrophe. For centuries, many scholars dismissed the famine story as symbolic theology. But modern climate research paints a far stranger picture. Geological studies of Nile sediment layers suggest periods of severe environmental instability during parts of the Bronze Age. Some ancient inscriptions even describe years of failed flooding, crop collapse, and social unrest. The possibility is unsettling. Perhaps the crisis was real, and Joseph's interpretation may have been less mystical than strategic. He understood patterns: agriculture, storage, economics, survival. Pharaoh recognized something extraordinary in him. Not magic, vision. Joseph proposed a massive national food storage system. During the years of abundance, grain would be collected and preserved across Egypt. When famine arrived, the kingdom would survive while surrounding nations collapsed. It was one of the earliest large-scale disaster management strategies ever described in ancient literature, and Pharaoh rewarded him beyond imagination. A slave became second only to the king himself. Suddenly, Joseph wore royal linen instead of chains. He rode through Egypt in official processions while citizens bowed before him. The young man, once abandoned in a pit, now controlled the food supply of an empire. But this is where the story becomes darker, because famine changes people. When hunger spreads, morality collapses quickly. Ancient records from multiple civilizations describe starving populations, selling land, livestock, and even family members simply to survive. According to Genesis, Joseph centralized grain distribution under Pharaoh's authority. As the famine worsened, Egypt gained enormous economic control over the population. Some modern historians argue this resembles the rise of centralized state power during crisis. Did Joseph save Egypt, or help transform it into something more authoritarian? The answer depends entirely on perspective. But regardless of interpretation, Joseph understood something few leaders ever truly grasp. Control food, and you control survival itself. Meanwhile, beyond Egypt's borders, the famine spread into Canaan, and eventually, Joseph's brothers arrived seeking grain. The same brothers who sold him into slavery now stood helpless before him, without recognizing who he had become. This part of the story feels almost cinematic in its cruelty. Joseph immediately recognized them, but instead of revealing himself, he tested them. He questioned them harshly, accused them of espionage, manipulated their fear. Why? Some theologians say he wanted proof they had changed. Others believe Joseph was struggling with trauma, buried for years beneath power and responsibility. Modern psychology suggests something similar. Victims of betrayal often seek emotional control when they finally gain power over former abusers. Joseph's tests may have been deeply personal. For the first time in his life, he held absolute power over the people who destroyed him. And yet, he did not kill them. That decision may be the most important leadership lesson hidden inside the entire story. Because revenge would have been easy. Forgiveness was harder. Eventually, Joseph revealed his identity in one of the most emotional scenes in ancient literature. His brothers expected punishment. Instead, Joseph wept openly before them, the powerful ruler of Egypt crying before starving shepherds from Canaan. Then came the line that would echo across thousands of years of history. What you intended for evil, God used for good. That sentence transformed Joseph from political survivor into spiritual symbol. His life became proof, for millions of believers, that suffering could carry hidden purpose. But the mysteries surrounding Joseph did not end there. In fact, they became even stranger. Archaeologists have spent decades searching for evidence connected to the biblical account. Direct proof remains elusive, yet certain discoveries continue to raise uncomfortable questions. Excavations in the Nile Delta have uncovered evidence of large Semitic populations living in Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. Ancient tomb paintings depict foreigners with clothing styles similar to descriptions from Canaan. Some administrative records reference non-Egyptian officials involved in storage and distribution systems. None prove Joseph existed, but they prevent the story from disappearing entirely into myth. Then there is the strange connection to the Hyksos rulers. The Hyksos were foreign kings who controlled parts of Egypt before being violently expelled. Ancient Egyptian texts later attempted to erase much of their memory. Some historians speculate that the memory of powerful Semitic administrators inside Egypt may have influenced later Hebrew traditions surrounding Joseph. Could Joseph have lived during this turbulent era? Could fragments of real political history survive beneath the religious narrative? No one can say for certain, and that uncertainty only deepens the mystery. Even Joseph's final years remain strangely silent. The Bible gives surprisingly little detail about the end of his life, despite his enormous influence. One of the most powerful men in Egypt simply fades from the historical spotlight. No massive tomb clearly identified as his has ever been discovered. No monumental inscriptions celebrate his achievements. For some researchers, that silence feels suspicious. Ancient Egyptian rulers documented everything: victories, famines, taxes, construction projects. Yet if Joseph truly held such extraordinary authority, why is direct evidence so limited? Some argue later dynasties erased records associated with foreign influence. Others believe the story became exaggerated over centuries until history and theology merged together. And then there are the dreams. Always the dreams. Modern neuroscience still cannot fully explain why human beings dream with such emotional intensity. Across ancient civilizations, dreams repeatedly shaped political and military decisions. Kings delayed invasions because of nightmares. Priests interpreted visions as warnings from the gods. Entire societies believed sleep opened a doorway between worlds. Joseph's rise began with dreams, and perhaps that detail reveals something deeper about leadership itself. Great leaders often see patterns others ignore. They sense danger before disaster arrives. They prepare while everyone else celebrates. Joseph understood famine during years of abundance. He recognized betrayal beneath smiles. He navigated slavery, prison, politics, and power without completely losing himself. That may be why his story survived when countless kings were forgotten. Because Joseph represents more than success. He represents transformation through suffering. The idea that broken people can still reshape history. Even today, leadership experts analyze Joseph's decisions as examples of crisis management, long-term planning, emotional intelligence, and resilience. Religious communities see divine providence guiding every stage of his journey. Skeptics view the story as mythologized history shaped by centuries of oral tradition. But perhaps the truth exists somewhere between both extremes. Because history is rarely clean. Ancient civilizations blended fact, legend, memory, and theology constantly. Real disasters became myths. Real rulers became symbols. Over generations, stories evolved until separating reality from interpretation became almost impossible. Joseph may have been a historical figure, or a literary creation inspired by multiple real events, or something in between. And maybe that uncertainty is exactly why the story still feels alive. Because beneath all the debates about archaeology and religion lies a timeless human fear. The fear of being abandoned. Forgotten, betrayed, and powerless. Joseph endured all of it, yet somehow emerged stronger. Not because the world became kinder, but because he learned how to survive inside darkness without allowing darkness to consume him completely. That is rare, especially in history. Most powerful men become monsters eventually. Empires rise through violence, paranoia, and greed. Ancient Egypt itself was built on systems of hierarchy and suffering hidden beneath beauty and gold. Yet Joseph's story insists that power alone does not define leadership. Character does. The ability to endure suffering without surrendering vision. The ability to prepare during peace for disasters others refuse to imagine. The ability to forgive when revenge feels justified. And perhaps most importantly, the ability to maintain faith while everything collapses. That may be why Joseph's story still resonates across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam thousands of years later. Three major civilizations continue preserving the memory of a slave who became a ruler without ever truly forgetting where he came from. But somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, unanswered questions remain buried. Lost tombs, destroyed records, forgotten cities swallowed by time. The ancient world still hides secrets modern humanity has not fully uncovered. Satellite scans continue revealing structures beneath desert sands. Archaeologists continue excavating settlements connected to Semitic migration into Egypt. Every new discovery adds another fragment to the puzzle. And perhaps that puzzle will never be completed. Perhaps Joseph's story survives precisely because it exists between history and mystery, between evidence and faith, between empire and exile. Tonight, the Nile still flows past ruined temples, where priests once studied dreams beneath torchlight. The desert still covers the bones of forgotten rulers and nameless slaves alike. Somewhere in that silence lies the memory of a young man thrown into a pit by his own brothers, a slave who walked through suffering, prison, and political chaos before rising to stand beside a king. And maybe the most haunting part of Joseph's story is this: the world tried repeatedly to bury him, but every time he disappeared into darkness, he returned more powerful than before. Perhaps that is why his story refuses to die, because deep down, humanity wants to believe that suffering is not meaningless, that betrayal is not the end, that even inside the darkest systems ever created by civilization, faith and vision can still survive. Or perhaps somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt, hidden beneath ruins not yet uncovered, the final truth about Joseph is still waiting to be found.